Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette. I think this is 192. I'm getting again, my Twitch updated, so it's different now, but hey, whatever. Hope I'm running. Think I am. So this is Philosophy Roulette, where we read and review philosophy papers. My apologies if I'm grumpy today. I had some papers out for review. They all got rejected, which is sort of fascinating, considering what I do with my spare time. And, it's like I've read a ton of papers. I know what gets published. It doesn't make it good what gets published, but it does make it of a certain type. And the question is, do you want to write for that type? And no, quite often I don't. And it's a hard thing to sort of accept. It's just like the papers I want to write are not the papers that are going to get published, which is just sort of fascinating. But I do love analysis because I am published in analysis, and I also like the length. I had a paper rejected from them, but they actually gave good feedback on a short paper. They were like, alright, whatever. I was like, you know what, if you're going to give quality feedback. But if you don't give quality feedback even, then, well, what are you going to do? So, the modal argument improved. Let's see. Alright, see what this is. If you join me live, you can grab the link in the show notes by grab the link here, or you can always type exclamation point paper and it will show up. Let's see if that even still works. I haven't done this in a while myself, and no one's tried. Oh, there you go. You see that? It's brilliant. So, yeah, I really got to figure out this stream manager stuff. I'm gonna reload this page and see what happens. Maybe it's a dead data sort of problem. Could easily be that. But anyway, let's see. Did I hit download? I don't think I did. But it's available. Yeah, so always like it when I get a paper quick. It always is nice. Oh wow, look at that. Yeah, so the computer also updated, which is kind of cool that it did that, but I gotta fix my layouts, unfortunately. Alright, so it's close enough that not a big deal. Can fix that better later. But as if you join me live, you can come and comment. But for now, we've got the modal argument improved by Brian Cutter in analysis. So let's see about this. The modal argument improved. Introduction. Let's see, this is all of 15 pages double-spaced. That's what I like to see. Perhaps the most important argument against materialism is the modal argument. In its standard form, the modal argument relies on a compatibility thesis along the following lines. Here, P stands for the conjunction of all physical truths. You see this right here? It's like the conjunction of all physical truths. I had some of the best advice I got when I was an undergrad is that if you're going to get a philosopher, you got to get them early. And the best philosophers tend to state what they're going to do very early, or at least they don't state it, but there's a very strong indication of what's happening here. How do you conjoin all physical truths? Why is that even something that can be conjoined? That's a very, very, very strong metaphysical position to be able to conjoin all. What are all physical truths? I have no idea. So this is nothing against this author. This is actually good that they state what they're doing so quickly. I like that. But just so you know, the idea that you conjunction and physical truths and you can go over all of them. So we've got like some very strong. Yeah. So like I said, I'm grumpy, but when I'm grumpy, I'm generally highly critical. And here we go. All of a sudden, how do you quantify overall physical truths? Why would we even think we could do such things? Okay, continuing. Compatibility. P is compatible with the absence of consciousness. That is, possibly the conjunction of all physical truths in this one little thing here, P, and there is no consciousness. So that means consciousness is not also inside P, I would assume. Because if consciousness is physical, then it would be this, and then there is no consciousness. But if it was already in P, then this would just be a contradiction. And this isn't the sort of paper that... it doesn't look like it's going to be dealing in contradictions. Alright, so... But you see, they already buried this thing I have a problem with inside P. So it's like a hidden... you hide your assumptions behind a variable. Very good. Good strategy. In some formulations of the argument, compatibility is treated as a premise directly supported by modal intuition. Again, what the hell is a modal intuition? In other formulations, is derived from a further premise about conceivability together with some principle linking conceivability to possibility. Okay. I mean, I already doubt this, so it's not conceivable to me, and my intuitions are not what yours are. So this, again, failing in the very quickly for me. Or at least I disagree. I'm not saying it's a failing argument. It's not my how I'm doing this. In others, it is derived from the premise that the phenomenal truths are not deducible from P, together with a principle linking deducibility to possibility. But these differences will not matter much for our purposes. What the heck is a phenomenal truth? I have no idea in this context. That's just like... I have no idea. It's a very big word. Very, very, very big word. And it's like right here, and it doesn't just, and they just sort of gloss over it. The route from compatibility to the falsity of materialism is fairly straightforward. Although there are delicate questions about how to define materialism, it is generally agreed that materialism entails a modal thesis to the effect that every positive truth is metaphysically necessitated by the conjunction of physical truths. And this is definitely not all physical truths. It's just that if you're a materialism, then the truth has to be part of, like, it has to be derivable from it's entailed by physical truth. So that means it's not like some God is doing something, it's something in the physical world is doing it. Okay, that consciousness exists is, I shall assume, a positive truth about our world. Thus, if P is compatible with the absence of consciousness, it follows that P fails to metaphysically necessitate some positive truth about our world, so materialism is false. We'll call this the standard modal argument. Okay. Yeah, so this is like classic presentations. I was like, all right, we got Kripke and Chalmers and these other folks from a little earlier, but like this is standard fare for analytic, like recent analytic philosophy. Oh yeah, any of the viewers out there, feel free to ask questions. But like I said, I'm in grumpy mood today, so super critical, not of you, of course, but I'm just going to be like tearing stuff apart just because that's how I feel. And I apologize to the author here. I do not mean to be grumpy about your work. Your work already seems good. In this paper, I propose an alternative modal argument that relies on a somewhat different modal premise. Instead of a compatibility thesis, my argument relies on an incompatibility thesis. Incompatibility. The existence of consciousness is incompatible with the completeness of the physical truths. That is, necessarily, P is complete. Then there is no consciousness. Okay, so we've got a difference here, and I can already see that this is why I like this author, because you're doing something negative. So if this is a conjunction, P and something. This is implication. So it's if you have the conjunction of all physical truths and that's complete, then there is no consciousness. So this is a weaker statement in some sense, because you have to. It only says if something happens, not this and that. All right. So there's already problems here, of course, but I'm sure the author will talk about this stuff. The notion of completeness can be understood either modally or ground theoretically. In the modal sense, the class of truth is complete, or amounts to a complete description of reality, if and only if its members jointly entail, metaphysically necessitate all positive truths. I mean, I guess I just don't want like negative truths, like something is not that. All right. But again, I this sort of quantification over the entire universe is very, very suspect in my book. So this all. What is this all positive truths? I mean, is that restricting the truths? That's gonna do something. In the ground theoretic sense, a class of truths is complete if and only if every positive truth outside that class is fully grounded in members of that class. Okay. So it's like, yeah, we've got some grounding scheme where truth is grounded in members of a class. Fine. The ground theoretic definition gives a somewhat stronger notion of completeness, at least given the orthodox assumption that full grounding entails metaphysical necessitation. That the ground theoretic definition may also have some minor advantage over the modal definition. For example, it may better capture the intuitive notion of a complete description of reality, and it yields a logically weaker and slightly more plausible incompatibility thesis, a fact that will have some relevance in section 3. However, the differences between two definitions will not matter a great deal for our purposes, and to simplify our discussion, I shall use completeness in accordance with the modal definition unless otherwise specified, mentioning the ground theoretic notion only where the differences matter to the argument. Okay, so basically, we're just going to be talking about this sort of thing, and you don't have to worry about the ground theoretical one. It's amounts to a complete description of reality only if its members jointly entail, as in metaphysically necessitate, all positive truths. Not entirely sure what all those words mean, but we'll figure it out. As with the standard modal argument, the route from our modal premise to the denial of materialism is straightforward. As we've seen, materialism is standardly taken to entail the physical truths are modally complete. Hence, given incompatibility together with the modest assumption that consciousness exists, the same assumption needed to bridge the logical gap between compatibility and the falsity of materialism, we may conclude that materialism is false. We'll call this the revised modal argument. I take incompatibility to have a great deal of intuitive support. Tell me whatever you like about the way particles and fields are distributed across space and time. There is a powerful intuition that, if any such description amounted to an exhaustive characterization of the world, there would be no consciousness. Why? I mean, that's not my intuition. I mean, I have very odd intuitions. Because I don't actually, don't know what exhaustive means here. I mean, they highlight this, but I have absolutely no idea what an exhaustive characterization of the world actually means. Because it seems to assume certain things about particles and fields as they describe the entire universe. Now, if you're restricting everything to particles and fields, then it obviously begs the question that there is no consciousness because they're just particles and fields. But then what does this exhaustive characterization mean? That it's just defined this way? So this argument is, I already find, like, it's either obviously begging the question or something else is going on here, and I'm not entirely certain. And the worst part about this for me is that everyone seems to just buy this. It's like, obviously it's not, if it's exhaustive and it's just particles and fields. Well, consciousness is not particles and consciousness is not fields. But then they want to say, well, there's something else there. But isn't that just begging the question? I don't know. Okay. It is not my purpose to persuade anyone of the truth of incompatibility or the falsity of materialism. My goal is rather to show that the revised modal argument is strictly superior to the standard modal argument in the following sense. Anyone who accepts the premises of the standard modal argument must accept the premises of the revised modal argument, but not vice versa. Since the only difference between the two arguments lies in their modal premises, this amounts to the claim that everyone who accepts the modal premise of the standard modal argument, compatibility, must accept the modal premise of the revised modal argument, incompatibility, but not vice versa. Okay, so I guess the whole point here is let's just ignore all the problems and just say mine's better than theirs. More specifically, I show that there are several anti-materialist views, including reasonable versions of idealism, Russellian monism, interactionist dualism, and theism that are inconsistent with the modal premise of the standard modal argument, but perfectly consistent with the premises of the revised modal argument. Those who accept or are merely unwilling to rule out any one of these views cannot endorse the standard modal argument, but can happily endorse the revised modal argument. Yeah, okay, that's fair, because as I pointed out, this is inherently weaker. Because of the difference in the logic right here. You've got a horseshoe versus a ampersand. And horseshoes are weaker than ampersands. Just like they just are. I mean, because one's an if. Like, so you have to accept something. So it's built into the statement itself that it's like you have to take something on as a premise before the argument goes through, and in the other one where you've just got these two things, if you like just given them, then it goes through. So it's weaker because it relies on you to actually affirm the antecedent in the formula. Okay. Now, this result might be insignificant if accepting incompatibility necessarily came with a commitment to compatibility, as would be the case if only possible reason for accepting incompatibility were a prior acceptance of compatibility. But there is no reason to think this is true. As we'll see, one can derive incompatibility from compatibility, so a prior acceptance of compatibility could be one's reason for accepting incompatibility. But one could also accept incompatibility simply because the existence of consciousness seems to one clearly to conflict with the idea that the physical truths exhaustively describe reality. And one could coherently make this judgment while denying or remaining neutral with respect to compatibility, perhaps because one accepts or is merely willing to rule out one of the views described in 3. By analogy, consider a similar pair of claims about geometry and color. Letting G stand for the conjunction of all purely geometric truths, we can distinguish between 2 modal theses. What is going on here? We've got a mathematical argument arguing for the betterment of the incompatibility thesis. Very interesting. All right, let's see. G compatibility. G is compatible with the absence of color. That is, possibly G and nothing is colored. So, because we're talking about geometry here, I guess. So, you don't have to have like a blue square. You can just have a square in geometry. And G incompatibility. The completeness of G is incompatible with the existence of color. That is, necessarily G is complete, and if nothing is complete, then nothing is colored. Okay, so yeah, so you can have, so if you have a full geometry, you still don't need color because of it. One might accept G incompatibility just because the existence of color seems to one clearly to conflict with the idea that geometric truths constitute an exhaustive characterization of reality. But suppose one also accepts or is merely unwilling to rule out Berkeley's thesis that nothing can have extinction without having some color or other. Then one must reject or be agnostic about G compatibility, since G logically implies the existence of extended things. There does not seem to be anything incoherent or epistemically unstable in this combination of attitudes. Okay, so this is just an aside, really. It's saying, hey, look, you couldn't possibly find some space between a compatibility argument and an incompatibility argument, even though they come to very, very similar conclusions. I guess this is just illustrative. I find it very interesting that they found it necessary to do this. I mean, I've had to do things like this when I'm working on stuff before, where you're just afraid that the reader's not going to buy your argument, so you have to put an illustrative example in. I mean, it's not padding. You've had enough experience with people not getting your arguments that you have to put something in there to be sure that like they actually understand that the two things aren't the same. So the question is, why did they do this here? What is so different? Well, frankly, if you go back, me harping on the horseshoe versus the ampersand, like the conjunction versus the implication, most people aren't going to be harping on that. I mean, so they'll think that, well, they basically come to the same thing, and so therefore there is no incompatibility because they'll probably have like the same sort of logical consequences under most considerations. But then a little explanation here goes like, hey, Berkeley's thesis, you can find the one point in logical space where they do disagree. And so that's why you do it, just to show that there are people who take weird metaphysical positions, and therefore you want to show that not weird metaphysical positions, but there are unique metaphysical positions that matter, and that's where there is a difference between these things. So basically, I guess that's what this argument, the author felt the necessity this is a significance argument to show that what they're doing is significant. And you can notice that by the treatment of Berkeley's thesis here. You can say, suppose one also accepts or is merely unwilling to rule out Berkeley's thesis that nothing can have extension without having some color or other. So this is just an appeal to an authority here. And that's why you're showing, great philosopher Berkeley said something, and therefore this is sort of a significant thing. Now the question is, of course, does this have anything at all to do with the claims in this paper? Doubtful. But it's showing that this sort of argument, the argument that they're making, they want to sort of show the significance here. And this is why I've had to do this sort of stuff, because I write stuff, I think it's interesting, but no one else seems to think it's interesting. And so that's kind of what I feel like is going on in this paragraph here. One of my favorite comments on a paper was, "This is an interesting and like well-written paper. I just have no idea why anyone would want to hold this view," and like that, and therefore I got rejected. I was like, "Oh, so I said something." Oh, it's like no, even better. They were like, "This is an interesting paper on an important topic," and then they said, "But I have no idea why anyone would want to hold this view." I was like, "Well, I wrote an interesting paper on an important topic. Isn't that good?" Guess not. Apparently not. Anywho, me being grumpy about philosophy because I just got rejected, my paper rejected. Alright, continuing. Or consider an analogous pair of modal claims concerning the Humean truths about the distribution of local categorical qualities across space and time, and the existence of causation. Let H stand for the conjunction of Humean truths. We can distinguish. See, this person's like me. They're really worried that people aren't going to believe them that like this matters. So they've got not just one example of this sort of thing mattering. They've got two examples of what their argument mattering. Let H stand for the conjunction of Humean truths. We can distinguish two modal theses. H compatibility. H is compatible with the absence of causation, that is, possibly H and there is no causation. H incompatibility. The completeness of H is incompatible with the existence of causation, that is, necessarily H is complete. If H is complete, then there is no causation. Again, one might accept H incompatibility just because the existence of causation seems to one clearly to be incompatible with the idea that Humean truths provide an exhaustive account of reality, Pache-Lewis. But suppose one also accepts, these are appeals to authority here. Not that that's a bad thing in this case. I don't want to pretend like appeals to authority are always bad. You're always appealing to authority. That's what references are. But like the whole argument here is actually an appeal to authority, and not in a bad way. Suppose one also accepts, or is merely unwilling to rule out, a version of the principle of sufficient reason that denies the possibility of uncaused property instantiations. Then one must reject or be agnostic about H compatibility, since H logically implies that there are property instantiations. Again, there does not seem to be anything incoherent or epistemically unstable about this combination of attitudes. Okay, again, does like the principle of sufficient reason have anything to do with the overall argument in this paper? I doubt it. Maybe it does, but like I don't think so. What are we talking about? We're talking about compatibility of modal compatibilities here, like consciousness. Why would principle of sufficient reason? I mean, maybe it does, but like I don't know. But see, the whole point of this section is this. It seems like this author is a bit afraid that they're going to be called. This paper is going to be called trivial, and in philosophy, when someone doesn't like what you're saying, they could just call it trivial because that just makes it sound bad. And so, I mean, if this is what happens when you're arguing well, and the people don't like it, then they come up with something else that you can't argue against. So then you end up putting in things like this that don't have like specific relation to your work, but then you put them in because it shows that your argument is significant in other ways. So it sort of bolsters the legitimacy, if you will. Again, this is a legit writing strategy, and so I'm not criticizing the author for like saying irrelevant things. I'm criticizing sort of the state of reviewing for academic journals. 2. Everyone who accepts compatibility must accept incompatibility. Here's a quick proof that compatibility entails incompatibility. Suppose compatibility is true, then true. We'll let W be an arbitrary world at which P completely describes reality. If there are no such worlds, then incompatibility is vacuously true. See, this is what I'm hanging on. I have no idea what completely describes reality, and then they made a vacuously true one. But then again, who cares if it's vacuously true? Why should we even care about that statement then? But like that's my problems, not author's problems. We'll assume for reductio that, you see, let me at least clarify why I don't like the vacuously true. The author is getting the vacuous truth out of the use of classical logic, which has its own assumptions. Now, if you're just going to start using classical truth because to gain yourself using classical logic to gain yourself classical truth in the situations you don't like, you're not actually explaining why those situations are good for you. You're just using a feature of classical logic, which is, again, something is very standardly done in academic philosophy, but again, it does not explain what is actually going on there. It's just an appeal to the logic. Okay, continuing. And we'll assume for reductio that consciousness exists at W. Since P is a complete description of reality at W, that is, since P entails every positive truth that holds at W, it follows from this assumption that P entails that consciousness exists. But the claim that P entails the existence of consciousness is equivalent to the negation of compatibility. Thus, given compatibility, it follows that any world at which P is complete is a world without consciousness. In other words, it follows that incompatibility is true. Okay, so the claim that P entails the existence of consciousness is equivalent to the negation of compatibility. So what they're doing is just pushing the negation through in the logic, and then you get this sort of, you can generate the incompatibility formula. Now the question is why? Why? What are you getting? What are you getting by doing this? That's a good question. Actually, I should come back to that. Let me highlight this right now. The claim that P entails the existence. Okay. So how is this move working is kind of interesting. Why is having the negation of compatibility, again, an appeal to logic, why does that matter in this sort of paper? Isn't this a metaphysical paper, not a logical paper? I don't know. We'll find out. Yeah, it's about modal stuff. Okay, 3. Not everyone who accepts incompatibility must accept compatibility. While everyone who accepts compatibility must accept incompatibility, the converse doesn't hold. I myself, for example, accept incompatibility, but I am agnostic about compatibility. In accepting incompatibility, I accept that if there are any possible worlds in which P completely describes reality, these worlds are devoid of consciousness. Hence, I accept that if P could be complete, compatibility is true. But I am agnostic about compatibility, in part because I have no idea whether P could be complete. More precisely, I am agnostic about compatibility because, for all I know, 1, P couldn't be complete, and 2, for any proposition Q such that the conjunction P and Q could be complete, P and Q jointly necessitate the existence of consciousness. Okay, so they're just saying, look, they're hands off whether what the universe is like, and they get this hands-offness by being by having an implication instead of a conjunction, because it's that if that I've been harping on. If P could be, like, they don't know, and so that gives them a little bit more wiggle room. To make this a bit less abstract, it will be helpful to describe some specific philosophical views such that if one accepts them or merely refuses to rule them out, one can accept incompatibility but not compatibility. I state 4 such views below, all of which implicitly deny the completeness of P. Each is described from the point of view of an imaginary proponent named the idealist, the Russellian monist, the interactionist dualist, and the theist. To be clear, the views described below are logically stronger than the general theses normally labeled idealism, Russellian monism, and so forth. They are rather specific versions of these general theses. Yeah, so again, this is a defense of the importance of the work being done here. They're giving all these names are incredibly suggestive of different sorts of views people do take, but again, they are not actually views, but they're close enough that the person's getting some, well, that makes what I'm saying here important credibility here. Okay, the idealist. Necessarily, all physical truths, for example, truths about the existence of tables, rocks, and electrons, are grounded in phenomenal truths. For example, truths about appearances, rock appearances, and appearance about electron detection equipment. Moreover, the physical truths are, at least to a limited extent, multiply realizable with respect to the underlying phenomenal truths. So the physical truths of our world might have been grounded in a slightly different pattern of phenomenal truths. For example, a pattern of experiences just like those in the actual world, but in which one visual sensation is slightly blurrier than in actual reality. I have no idea if that actually makes any sense to say that things would be, that the phenomenal has no, you can change the phenomenal and the underlying reality is the same. What's footnote 4? Oh, the views along these lines are defended. Okay, you see that, but people actually do say this, so that's what all the author here needs. On this view, physical truths are necessarily underwritten by consciousness, so P could not hold in the absence of consciousness. This view is therefore inconsistent with compatibility, but it is consistent with incompatibility. Indeed, it entails incompatibility, for it entails that P could not be complete. Those who accept or are merely unwilling to rule out this form of idealism can therefore accept incompatibility, but must be agnostic at best about compatibility. Thus, those who wish to attack materialism while endorsing or remaining neutral on this alternative to materialism cannot use the standard modal argument, but can use the revised modal argument. The revised modal argument enjoys a modest additional advantage if we adopt the ground theoretic definition of completeness. The points above would then also apply to a variant idealist view that denies that P could be grounded in a different set of phenomenal truths. Yeah, so an alternate reality, but say like the universe was set up differently to begin with, and so all of history is different, but it's the same, like, just sort of, it was so everything is like, just say, mirror imaged, just the whole universe is sort of like flipped left or something, and so it's like what we all call left, they all call right, and so like it's a phenomenal truth that everything we are calling on left we perceive to be mirror imaged, but it would be the exact same world in some sense. Both idealist views are inconsistent with compatibility. And given the asymmetry of grounding, both views entail that P couldn't be ground theoretically complete. The physical truths cannot ground their own phenomenal grounds, so incompatibility comes out vacuously true. Alright, Russellian monist. Physical truths like P are entirely truths about structure and dynamics, truths concerning the causal, spatio-temporal, mathematical, and logical relations among entities, and the way these relationships evolve over time. But structural truths must have some non-structural quiddative ground. Quiddity, alright. Quiddity is the whatness of a thing. It's that, it's the sort of the type of thing. It must have some type-specific ground. Some kind of intrinsic or categorical underpinning. Yeah, the category. And then quiddity is paired with hexaity. Hexaity is the particular instance, the thisness of a particular thing. The quiddity is the whatness or the category of the particular thing. So you have like, this is my hand. That's the quiddity, what it is. My particular one is its hexaity. So, but you have a hand too. Like they have the same quiddity, but not the same hexaity. Some kind of intrinsic or categorical underpinning. In my view, the categorical underpinnings of these structural truths play an indispensable role in grounding consciousness. Okay, so we've got people that argue for that too. Now, the structural truths discovered by physics are, at least to a limited extent, multiply realizable. That is, the same physical truths could be grounded in a slightly different set of categorical qualities. But in my view, any set of quiddative truths sufficient to ground P would also suffice to ground consciousness of the kind we enjoy. Okay, so instead of having a phenomenal difference, we could have like sort of conceptual shifts between things. So my concept of hand is not exactly the same as your concept of hand, but we could we could keep doing that so that our concepts of hand are slightly farther and farther away from what we each think of our concept of hand, and therefore you could then get to the same sort of, you could still have the same sort of underlying world with all sort of slightly different concepts, but it sort of all comes together to have the same sort of rational structure in the end. So that's the structure and dynamics. It all works together sort of the same way, just we sort of move some concepts around a little bit. And so you could still have the same sort of reality there. And please, anyone out in the audience, feel free to ask questions. Again, this view is inconsistent with compatibility, for it implies that P could not hold in the absence of an appropriative quiddative basis, where any appropriate quiddative basis for P would suffice to ground consciousness. But it is so. If you have, like, if there was consciousness, then you could also make consciousness with all these sort of shifted ideas of the shifted concepts. The quiddative basis, the conceptual basis for consciousness, would then follow from the conceptual basis of everything else. But that would be a problem for compatibility. But it is consistent with incompatibility. Indeed, it entails incompatibility, for it entails that P, that all the conjunction of the worldly facts, could not be complete. Those who accept or are merely unwilling to rule out this form of Russellian monism can therefore accept incompatibility, but must be agnostic at best about compatibility. Thus, those who wish to attack materialism while endorsing or remaining neutral on this alternative to traditional materialism cannot use the standard modal argument, but can use the revised modal argument. Again, the revised modal argument enjoys a modest additional advantage if we adopt the ground theoretic definition of completeness. The points above would then also apply to a variant of Russellian monist view that denies that P could be grounded in a different set of quantitative truths, as some Russellian monists do. Both Russellian monist views are inconsistent with compatibility, and given the asymmetry of grounding, both Russellian monist views entail that P could not be ground theoretically complete. The physical truths cannot ground their own quantitative grounds. So incompatibility comes out vacuously true. Vacuously true. That is a logical term, not a metaphysical one. The interactionist dualist. Consciousness is a non-physical process, but it has non-redundant causal influence on physical processes in our brains. Now the author accepts a version of the principle of sufficient reason, according to which the actual physical effects of conscious states could not occur uncaused, though they could have had different conscious causes. Since, on my view, there are only two possible types of events, physical events and conscious events, the physical events that occur in human brains cannot occur in the absence of either a physical cause or a conscious cause. So we've got two different kinds of causes, physical and conscious, and so there we go. Yeah, interactional dualist. Okay, makes sense. This view is inconsistent with compatibility, for assume the view is correct. Now consider some physical event in my brain, say an electron swerve. Do electrons swerve? I have no idea. I don't think they do, but that doesn't matter. That is non-redundantly caused by a conscious state, so we've got like magic consciousness now is affecting the trajectory of an electron. And let us suppose for a reductio that there exists a possible world W that duplicates all the physical truths of our world but is devoid of consciousness. Since W duplicates all the actual physical truths, W includes the electron swerve. Moreover, in W, the swerve will lack a physical cause because the swerve lacks a physical cause in our own world, and W is exactly like our world in physical respects. It's a miracle when things like that happen. That's what we call those things, when the physical world changes without a physical cause. And of course, it will also lack a conscious cause since W is stipulated to be devoid of consciousness. Now, according to the view described above, the only possible kinds of occurrence are physical occurrences and conscious occurrences. Since neither type causes the swerve in W, the swerve must be uncaused in W, contradicting the view's commitment to the principle of sufficient reason. That there's causal closure is basically it. So we've got an uncaused thing, but a principle of sufficient reason says all things have to be caused by some sort of, we can at least figure it out. There's a reason why. The view described above is therefore inconsistent with compatibility, but it is consistent and indeed entails the vacuous truth of incompatibility. Vacuous truth. Those who accept or are unwilling to rule out this form of interactionist dualism can therefore accept incompatibility, but must be agnostic at best about compatibility. So as before, those who wish to attack materialism while accepting or remaining neutral on this alternative to materialism cannot consistently use the standard modal argument, but can use the revised modal argument. Let me mention it now while I remember. This is an argument by cases here, clearly. You've got, like, the Russellian monist, the interactionist dualist, whatever that other one was above, and then we're going to have one more below. There was four. The concept of arguing by cases, especially in philosophy, but other places too. But, I mean, if you're arguing by cases in, like, a mathematical context, then you can be sure that if you say there are four mathematical... Alright, so, like, let's even simplify it. Is 5 odd or even? I mean, there's only two things, so you argue by cases. If it's not odd, then it has to be even, and you can argue for one or the other. So it's like, you can just go find out, but you argue by cases. But there is in defined systems like just like typical mathematics, that defined system defines how many cases there are. In this sort of thing, it's not so clear that there are this number of cases. So we're not actually arguing by strict argument by cases here. We're again arguing by sort of this argument to significance. Enough cases of things people think are important matter to this view, and therefore by arguing enough cases it shows significance of the view. Now the question is, are all these cases really that different? Are they all sort of a certain class, and maybe this is only a corner of the philosophical world that no one actually cares about, and therefore this is all window dressing? I mean, I don't think that's the case. I think these are all pretty why you can name them and just define them so quickly, and that's okay, makes it seem like these are significant views. But again, that could just be window dressing. I don't think it is, and I'm not accusing the author of doing such things. I think this is a good strategy for their argument. But again, think about how they are arguing for their point. They're trying to show that they have covered some significant amount of ground with their argument, and it matters for all of that ground that they're covering. But is this really an argument by cases? No. Is this an argument by sort of overwhelming, sort of overwhelming these, like getting over a limit of significance? That's kind of what's going on here, and they're doing it by arguing for cases that sound sufficiently different. Again, I apologize for my grumpiness today, but I am grumpy. Again, the revised modal argument enjoys, and please ask questions. Again, the revised modal argument enjoys a modest additional advantage if we adopt the ground theoretic. Oh, did I read this already? Yes. Or no, I've been highlighting vacuously true. One way or the other. Let me reread this. I can't even remember now. Again, the revised modal argument enjoys a modest additional advantage if we adopt the ground theoretic definition of completeness. The point above would then also apply to any form of dualism, whether epiphenomenalist or interactionist, that endorses necessitarianism about the psychophysical laws. So the physical events mentioned in P necessarily cause but do not ground consciousness of the kind we find in our world. Each of these forms of dualism is inconsistent with compatibility, and each entails P cannot be ground theoretically complete, since they entail entail that physical truths can't ground consciousness, and that P cannot hold without consciousness. So incompatibility comes out vacuously true. So I wonder is this the first time we've actually mentioned the term dualism? Because that's really what's going on here. But yeah, I don't know. The theist. God exists necessarily, and necessarily all contingent facts are caused by God's creative activity. Because God is essentially good and wise, there are certain conceivable scenarios that are impossible only because it would be contrary to God's goodness and wisdom to create them. For example, a scenario in which a virtuous person suffers forever with no greater good arising from her suffering is perfectly conceivable, but it is impossible because it's contrary to God's essential goodness to create it. The same goes in my view for a scenario in which P holds in the absence of consciousness. Truths about consciousness are neither identical nor grounded in any physical truths, and a zombie world of this sort is perfectly conceivable. But it is not possible because God would not create it. After all, a universe without consciousness, a universe with only unthinking and unfeeling matter, would be a universe without any meaning or value. Such a universe would be profoundly pointless, a kind of cosmic farce, and it is unbefitting of God's goodness and wisdom to create such a world. I don't know if I've actually heard this argument for the existence of consciousness, that there is no value there. Couldn't there be value without consciousness? I don't know. But that's an interesting argument. I'm sure there's some way to slice goodness and wisdom that don't involve consciousness. I'm not associated with it. I don't know enough about these sorts of things. But I mean, I guess the best of all possible worlds then, or like any possible world God would create, would require there to be consciousness there, or at least some sort of ethical thing, because that's the sort of thing God cares about. Okay. Whatever. This view again is clearly consistent with clearly inconsistent with compatibility, but it is consistent with incompatibility, and the fact entails the vacuous truth of incompatibility, given the assumption that some positive truths about God or specific phenomenal grounds about his creation can vary across worlds while holding P fixed. Those who accept or are unwilling to rule out this form of theism can therefore accept incompatibility, but must be agnostic about compatibility. Thus, those who wish to attack materialism while accepting or remaining neutral on this theistic view cannot use a standard modal argument, but can use the revised modal argument. You can even see this sort of strategy in the strategy I was describing earlier in this writing. It's repetitive writing in a good way. The repetitive writing in the good way is because it hammers the point home. Now, if this was really just an argument by cases, you wouldn't need to hammer anything home. You just say, well, these were all the cases, and therefore the argument holds. But this is hammering the point home each time to show that in these different scenarios, the exact same result holds, and therefore in these what is conceivably different, it does this sort of thing. Okay. Anything else to say about that? No, it's just all the same thing over and over. Once again, the revised modal argument enjoys a modest additional advantage if we adopt the ground theoretic definition of completeness. The points above would then apply also to a variant form of theism, according to which P necessitates but doesn't ground all positive truths, including all truths about God and all specific phenomenal truths. Both forms of theism are inconsistent with compatibility, and each entails P couldn't be ground theoretically complete, since each implies that the truths about consciousness, and presumably also truths about God, couldn't be grounded in physical truths. So incompatibility comes out vacuously true. I guess I like this, the vacuousness. But again, it's the same sort of, it's the repetition of argumentation here is showing that the argument is so strong because it's just the same sort of result in all these different cases. Okay, it's worth noting that some views above require the assumption that P is compatible with the falsity of some actual phenomenal truths, even if it is not compatible with the absence of consciousness altogether. This is clearest in the case of the idealist, who assumes that we can hold P fixed while making small changes to its phenomenal basis. Sure. If we therefore accept a weaker compatibility thesis according to which P is compatible, not with the falsity of C, the proposition that consciousness exists, but with the falsity of C star, the conjunction of all actual phenomenal truths, in fact, the idealist must accept the possibility that P and not C star, if she wishes to accept incompatibility on its modest construal, that is, with completeness understood modally rather than ground theoretically. The idealist held that all physics was and not consciousness star, that is, the conjunction of all actual phenomenal truths. Okay. Yeah, so physics and not all phenomenal truths. If the idealist held this, it is impossible to say because she thought that P couldn't be grounded in a different set of phenomenal truths. It would presumably follow that P is modally complete, and hence that incompatibility is false. Something similar arguably goes for the interactionist dualist if she claims that P and not C star is impossible, as might be the case if the causal roles played by our phenomenal states couldn't be played by different phenomenal states, or necessitarianism holds for the psychophysical laws. This would arguably commit her to the claim that P is modally complete, and hence that incompatibility is false. Thus, while the proponents of these views will not endorse the standard modal argument, they may have to endorse a variation on it that replaces compatibility with the weaker compatibility thesis that P and not C star is possible, at least if they wish to accept incompatibility on its modest construal. Okay, so this is actually kind of nice, because this is making their argument stronger, showing that they had proved what they wanted in a special case, but then they showed that you can, again, that their special case expands out to then chip away at what compatibility used to have too. So that's nice. Still, the revised modal argument retains significant advantages even over this variation on the standard modal argument. First, the idealist and the dualist are only committed to the possible of P and not C star if they wish to accept the modal construal of incompatibility. There are versions of idealism and dualism, already mentioned above, that reject the possibility of P and not C star while endorsing the ground theoretic construal of incompatibility. For example, dualist views that accept necessitarianism about the psychophysical laws, and idealist views that deny that P could have been grounded in a different set of phenomenal truths. The same goes, of course, for the theist who embraces necessitarian dualism, and the Russellian monist who denies that P could have been grounded in a different set of quiddative truths. Both deny the possibility of P and not C star while accepting the vacuous truth of the ground theoretic reading of incompatibility. This highlights an advantage of the ground theoretic construal of the revised modal argument over the modal construal. The former relies on a logically weaker incompatibility premise, one that can be accepted with fewer arguments regarding the exact modal relationship between the physical and the phenomenal. Yeah, see, right here is where the rubber's hitting the road. How do you connect logic, physics, and phenomenology? Second, not all the views above require the possibility of P and not C star even to accept the modal construal of incompatibility. For example, the Russellian monist does not need to accept the possibility of P and not C star to accept incompatibility on its modal reading. She can hold that P is compatible with some variation in the quitative truths, so P won't be modally complete, but not with any variation in the phenomenal truths, so P and not C star will be impossible. This is consistent so as long as the quitative truths, the base level truths with respect to which our conscious states are multiply realizable, are merely proto-phenomenal rather than phenomenal. Likewise, the theist does not require the possibility of P and not C star in order to accept the modal construal of incompatibility. For example, she might combine necessitarian dualism, which implies the possibility of P and not C star, with the claim that P couldn't be modally complete, which implies incompatibility, perhaps on the ground that God's own positive properties can vary across worlds that hold fix the truth of P. Okay, so these are just going through some more general, there's sort of generalizing on the results so that even more people have to be covered. Again, making the argument put forward in this paper more significant. Conclusion. To summarize, I've argued that the revised modal argument is strictly superior to the standard modal argument in the sense that the key modal premise of the revised argument is more modest, logically weaker. That's what I was harping on the whole time. And is consistent with a range of reasonable anti-materialist views that are ruled out by the standard modal argument. Those who accept or are merely unwilling to rule out any one of these views cannot make use of the standard modal argument in their objection to materialism, but they may avail themselves of the revised modal argument. Okay, very nice paper, actually. My grumpiness notwithstanding. I was trying to show how this was argued for, because, I mean, frankly, one can just, like, if you know something about, like, the structure of logic, you know the horseshoe is generally, like, these formulas here, like, are pretty close to each other, because they're basically off by a negation or two, and you can sort of move things around and do it. But the horseshoe here, the if-then, means that this is weaker because it is vacuously true in a lot of cases. And as I highlighted over and over and over again, that's what the author here is making use of. They're getting out of the uncomfortable situations, because when they want to be agnostic or not say anything about a particular case, that case is where they made that situation vacuously true, because they don't have to accept that if they don't accept some sort of thesis, then it becomes vacuously true, and the whole statement becomes vacuously true because of the way classical logic is set up. Now, the question, of course, that I would have is, well, if you're setting these things up this way, that's because you want them to be this way, so maybe we shouldn't be using the classical, like, why do we understand classical logic in this way, and isn't there some sort of background assumptions going on there, and does that matter for the consciousness argument being pushed here? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. Probably there's a good argument that I'm just nuts, but again, the fact that every time the author wanted to get out of the trouble, they went and were like, well, and in this case, it just becomes out true because it's vacuously true, because that's how the logic is. Well, why are you appealing to logic there? Is that a good thing? And what's the metaphysical reasoning going on? But other than that, I mean, that's really just my... very few people are going to care about that except for me. But that's actually a good sign for this author, because that means very few people are going to have the same gripes I am, and they're going to accept this argument. I think is pretty good otherwise. But like I said, you can basically, I mean, this paper could have been done, like, again, like all of this here was just showing that their argument is significant. All of this, like from here down, basically. Where am I? Yeah, so like basically, from this point in the paper on, their argument is done. They've done everything. Like, this is the whole thing, is like 2-3 pages. And then they went on for page after page showing the results, which is fine. That's a good thing. But the results here this isn't even results. They're just arguing that, like, this stuff matters, like this argumentation is good. So they're arguing here for the form of their argument, and then they go on to show that then basically the argument even now that you've accepted the form of the argument, that you should accept the result of the argument being significant, because all these other views, it will apply to all these other views. So that's the structure of how this paper is written. They basically said what they wanted to in the first 3 pages, argued that how they said it is legit, and then what they said is legit. And then let's see, is there anything else? And then at the end they also, and then they just expanded a little bit to show that even though they had a special form of the argument that worked out best, you can just shift things around a little bit to make it even more significant. So this is well written in terms of argumentative style. It's pretty clean, which is nice. Well, I mean, makes for a good, makes it easy for me to explain. And then they did one of these concluding things, a summary thing. See, again, I feel for this person. Look at this. Section 4, and they start off to summarize. They could have just put to summarize right here, but again, this is I feel this person's pain a little bit, because I feel the whole structure of the paper is to convince people that this matters, and then they can't even, they could have just put section 4 could have said summary, but they repeated themselves. Why would you repeat yourself? And it's well, they did it because you're and this whole thing is just a repetition of what happened. It's because people are going to screw it up, and they do. And so that's why this is good, because it prevented even screw-ups at the end. And this is actually one of the things I should have done in one of my papers that just got rejected, was I should have put this sort of summary thing, because one of the reviewers definitely screwed up the point of my argument right at the end. And I was like, you're killing me. You were I had you the whole way, and then I didn't summarize properly, and they sort of thought I was going a different direction that I wasn't going, and they were like, well, that's wrong. I was like, well, I didn't say that, but they were like, well, they thought I went off, and I didn't do it right. So this is what happens. Okay, thank you for watching. If anyone out there, I might come back and do another paper or something else real soon, but that's it for the second. I'm gonna go step out for a sec. I'll be right back.